Well, I think the government need to get round the table with the unions and resolve this matter. I don't think kind of inflaming this situation is going to abort the strikes and stop these strikes from happening.
Do you think that's what she's doing? The culture secretary.
Well, her tone.
The education secretary, forgive me.
I mean, her tone, I think, was a lot softer on your programme earlier, but clearly she's being instructed by the Prime Minister and others to not discuss pay, to not have these negotiations in any meaningful way. And clearly they need to happen because teachers are crying out for a conversation, they're crying out to be heard, they need supporting. And I think if we look back at COVID, what did we learn? We learned that children missing school is greatly damaging to those young people. I've got children myself. We can see the damage. No one wants to see strikes happening. But I think we also learned the value that teachers bring and that how many of us can't step in and become teachers to children overnight, and children need that face-to-face teaching. So that's why it needs proper negotiation, meaningful negotiation. Get round the table, stop these strikes from happening because it's the last thing that parents and children need.
It will cause a spiral in inflation if all of these pay rises are agreed to by the government.
Well, that's their opinion, but what we've seen over a long period of time, now it's not just this year, these strikes haven't just happened in the last few months. They've been brewing and brewing for a long time because what we've seen is real terms pay cuts for our public sector workers over a long period of time. You'll remember the George Osborne, David Cameron coalition that came in and pegged public sector pay at 1% for a number of years, and they were sucked up at the time because there was supposed to come a day where the country could afford to pay people properly. And now those same public sector workers are being told that the country can't afford to pay them
But it's a global issue, though, isn't it? It's not just this government. It's a problem that the whole world is having to deal with at the moment, and that is off the back of the pandemic. The government tell us there just isn't any money.
Well, it is. There are some global factors, but the UK is particularly exposed to those. The UK has been more affected by some of these issues than most other Western countries, and we're not seeing strikes, public sector strikes, on the sort of scale that we're seeing in this country and in other places, because I think we've seen a strategy over recent months of the government to almost goad some of these strikes. We've seen a little bit of change in tone more recently, but you know, the only way that industrial action and these kind of disputes gets resolved is when everybody gets round the table and finds a way forward to it. So if the Education Secretary is not discussing the one issue that the unions want to discuss with her, then they're not going to get resolved, are they?
Online safety bill. Your opposite number, the Culture Secretary, going to toughen up the online safety bill and make social media bosses criminally liable for failing to protect children. I'm guessing you're going to say about time.
Absolutely about time. It's something that we have been calling for. In fact, we voted on a number of times over the last few months in the House of Commons. But we do have to remember that this very recent strengthening that we're hearing about overnight, which the government have been forced into doing after a rebellion brewing on their own side, comes after they really watered down this bill before Christmas. So these criminal sanctions are welcome. We want the regulator to have the teeth to really go after some of these big tech companies that are global companies. But the scope of the criminal sanctions is now a lot narrower because the scope of the bill is much narrower. So it's only really going to be about protecting children online, not many of the other harms that we see in social media and online, like disinformation, misogyny, racist abuse, and all of these challenges that we face as a society and as a country.
Do you think the Prime Minister was right to block this latest draft law by the Scottish Government when it comes to gender ID?
Well, look, we don't need to be here when it comes to this issue. The last thing we need is an issue like this becoming the product of a bun fight, essentially, a political posturing between the Scottish nationalist government and the UK government. We didn't need to end up here. The Scottish Secretary, I think, we don't know exactly what he's going to say today. We don't know what legal advice they've had, but he seemed to suggest that there was a bill that the government could have lived with, that wouldn't have been in conflict with UK equalities legislation. Well, if that's the case, why wasn't the government in the UK talking to the Scottish government over many of the previous months to resolve this before we even got to this point? So we don't want to see this being turned into a big constitutional row and a big standoff between the Scottish government and the UK government. We want a law that protects people's trans rights, that protects women's rights, and that doesn't create these kind of cross-border sort of bureaucratic, difficult issues about how laws apply in one country to another. It could have been resolved before now, and we hope it still can be.
Your leader says that 16 is too young for someone to decide whether they should be able to legally change their gender or not. The Education Secretary said to me in the last hour that it's not. She thinks that 16 is the right age. What do you think?
Well, I think these issues, people have their own views about that. Well, I think these are complicated issues, but I totally respect Keir Starmer's view on that and other people's views. But I think this is a lot bigger than that, this particular issue that we're now facing, because it is a constitutional crisis, a constitutional matter. And let's not forget that, well, look, I think the Labour Party, we brought in the Gender Recognition Act in the first place. We also brought in the Equalities Act. We also brought in the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Act that gave rise to these powers that the Secretary of State's using today. We never wanted to see this situation. That's not what all of those big progress that we made as a party for this country in these areas, we didn't want to see them being reduced in this way to a constitutional row.
So you're not going to give me a yes or no on that, but I'm sure you'll have a view on this Metropolitan Police Officer, David Carrick, who has admitted 49 charges, including 24 counts of rape over 17 years. How on earth could he still have been imposed that whole length of time?
Well, these are the questions that I think rightly are being asked. What an appalling, awful case this is. And I want to pay tribute to the women who came forward and ensured that eventually this guy was held to account and has been found guilty for a huge number, over a long period of time, of rapes and sexual misconduct and abuse, and how he was able to use his role in the police force as a cover, as a way of being able to get away with these crimes. You know, these are the big questions that are being asked. And I think we're right, 2 years after, well, more than 2 years after the awful case of Sarah Everard, which has got many of the same hallmarks, we find that there's this other case that at the time, he wasn't even suspended at the time, even after Sarah Everard, when these very serious allegations he was facing. So there are some big questions here. We were promised 2 or 3 years ago that we would have new actions in terms of police misconduct, in terms of vetting, police vetting, and these processes. The government said they were going to bring them in after the Sarah Everard case, and we're still waiting them. So I think women and others across the country will be rightly asking how this continued to happen even after the Sarah Everard case.
How can people who live in one of the biggest cities in the world and tourists that come to one of the biggest and most popular cities in the world have faith in a police force when this sort of thing happens?
Well, there are serious questions, I think, for the Metropolitan Police, and some of these issues are being looked at by an independent inquiry, which I think could be extended to look at this current case. They're obviously trying to root this out, but I think what we need is more enforceable laws and guidance, tougher action. That's what Labour said we will do, to ensure that there are consistent and clear processes around how serious allegations are dealt with, that they should involve immediate suspension and immediate taking off the beat in these sorts of cases. We need to have much clearer vetting regime that is nationally applied and clearly understood, because we've got to restore some trust and accountability into our police force, as you say, so that people can feel that they are being safe and looked after in our capital city.